Have you ever wondered what it felt like to walk into a palace as a boy and never walk out again? Not because of chains, but because of silence? Not because of bars, but because the person you were before simply ceased to exist? Maybe you're listening to this in the quiet hours of the night, lying in a dark room, with the gentle hum of a fan overhead or the soft rustle of fabric beside you. Maybe your eyes are half closed. Maybe you were scrolling through something meaningless, and this strange title caught your eye. Male concubines? In the Ottoman Empire? Was that real? Yes, and not only real, it was normal. Disturbingly normal. Welcome, then, to a different kind of story. One that doesn't shout or demand attention. One that moves like a candle in a sealed hallway. Gentle but unsettling. Please subscribe to the channel, so next time you're drifting towards sleep, you'll have another strange historical thread to pull at. And tell us, where are you listening from? Lahore? London? New York? Or from a quiet corner of your mind, where the past feels like it might still be breathing somewhere behind the curtains? Tonight, we begin in the Topkapi Palace of Istanbul. It's the late 17th century. The city is asleep. Mostly. The dogs in the alleys have quieted. The ships in the Bosphorus drift with their lanterns dimmed, and the palace glows faintly under a milky sky. Inside, through a corridor paved with smooth marble, a boy walks barefoot. He's about 13, maybe 14. His head is shaved. He's been oiled with rose water and olive paste. His lips are cracked from travel, but he doesn't speak. His name, once common and shouted by a mother on a village path, has been taken from him. He is now called something ceremonial, perhaps Yusuf Aga or Mehmet Kalfa, a title pretending to be an identity. He has been chosen, or more accurately, selected. He does not know by whom, or exactly why, only that he is here now, and what happens next is not for him to decide. He was bought, or gifted, or seized, perhaps even surrendered by his family in hopes of social rise. He has passed through inspections, been touched by gloved hands that poked and measured, and has now arrived at the place where boys are reshaped. This palace, grand and serene, has wings hidden from the tourists of our time. The Black Eunuch Quarter, the Privy Chamber, the narrow alleys between women's rooms and male silence. There is no blood on the floor, no screaming in the walls, just quiet ritual. He is led into a tiled room glowing blue and gold. A eunuch, tall and wearing a silk sash, instructs him to remove his robe. The eunuch's voice is gentle, but without warmth, like someone reciting a recipe. Water is poured. Incense is lit. The boy breathes it in and stares at the ceiling as the world prepares to erase him. The process is clinical, and we won't describe it in detail here. Just know it has been performed many times on many boys with varying degrees of survival. Sometimes the goal is to remove just enough to nullify a sexual threat, but preserve function. Sometimes it's total. The reasons vary by ruler, era, and preference. But in every case, one thing is clear. After this, the boy no longer fits into the world he came from, and the world he has entered will never fully call him one of its own. If he survives, he is called lucky. If he recovers, he is trained. But what does that mean? Training begins in silence. Speech is rare, except in whispers. The boy's oar. Now eunuchs are taught to read Ottoman script, to walk without sound, to anticipate royal needs without eye contact. They learn the names of pillows, the proper distance to bow, and the angle of their fingers when offering sherbet to a sultan's guest. They sleep in rows, heads shaved again and again. Their dreams, if they have them, are theirs alone. No one speaks of what they were. No one asks. They are reborn without childhoods. The palace calls them trusted ones. But this trust has conditions: absolute obedience, invisible presence, and sometimes suffering. A favored eunuch might rise to great power, become the chief black eunuch, wield influence behind the veils of the harem, manage court secrets and rivalries. But even at the height of such power, his body remains the site of a decision made long ago without consent. Some develop intricate rituals to cope, breathing patterns before entering a room, secret gestures of mourning, or whispered phrases remembered from a mother's lullaby. Others simply dissolve into the routines, becoming perfect servants until history forgets their names completely. Still, some carve messages into wood, stone, or even the undersides of marble benches, names no one noticed until centuries later, etched faintly beneath royal baths. In the public record, they don't exist. In the personal lives of sultans, they were essential. To the empire, they were useful tools. To themselves, perhaps, ghosts with duties. But the most disturbing truth isn't just what was done to them. It's how completely the system made it normal. The silence around them was cultivated, polished, and passed down. An empire, brilliant and brutal, built entire bureaucracies on its back. And yet, no paintings, no statues, no tombs with titles. Just layers of stone, polished by the feet of boys who never had a choice. But what happened once one of them tried to resist, to leave, to fall in love, to remember his past? That is a story few dared to tell. But in the next part, we'll go deeper. Because what happened in the harem wasn't just about sex, or power, or hierarchy. It was about rewriting identity itself, softly and completely, until even the subject forgot who he once was. The boy we met before, now half forgotten even. I himself is no longer walking through cold corridors barefoot. He walks now with slippers, velvet-lined, soft-soled, silent. He has learned not to let the heel strike first. He has learned that silence is not just a virtue here, it is survival. It has been months, maybe a year. No one marks time openly in the harem quarters, because time is not a friend. There are no seasons in the marble palace. The sun filters through latticework and colored glass, but the air remains always the same, fragrant with jasmine and something metallic, a blend of rosewater and rust. The eunuchs live in shadows, even when they're in full view. They are trained to anticipate without looking. The way their hands move is studied, how they pour tea, how they carry letters between the queen mother and the sultan, how they disappear into alcoves like smoke. But beneath the movements, a different training unfolds, one more hidden and more dangerous. They are being taught not just etiquette, but erasure, to fold their desires into origami, tight and invisible. No one tells them to forget. They are simply never asked to remember. And slowly, the past becomes a foggy hallway with no doors. Some boys, especially the younger ones, cry in their sleep. The older eunuchs do not scold them. They simply wait it out, like watching a fever break. Others develop small tics, a thumb tapping against a wrist, or a prayer said backward in a native tongue they're no longer allowed to speak. But even these gestures fade over time, because every act of individuality carries risk. Not always punishment, sometimes just demotion. A reassignment, a quiet disappearance. The palace, after all, is not cruel in the usual sense. It is not full of whips and dungeons. It is much quieter than that. More elegant, more patient. The boys are given beautiful clothing. Deep-colored robes, silk sashes, and sandlippers embroidered with gold thread. But the beauty is a kind of disguise, like dressing a cage in flowers. You'll hear them called black eunuchs or white eunuchs, a distinction not of uniform, but of origin. The black eunuchs, mostly from sub-Saharan Africa, are given charge of the inner harem and are seen as more loyal, more detached. The white eunuchs, often from the Balkans or Caucasus, deal with outer administrative tasks. This racial division is rarely discussed, but deeply embedded in the structure. Both categories serve the same machine, the same silence, the same dismembered childhood, and both are expected to act as if they chose this, as if their loyalty is a virtue, not a survival tactic. Some of the more literate eunuchs begin to write. Not poetry, that would be too dangerous, but reports, notes, memoranda. They become scribes, keepers of secrets. They know who enters whose chamber, at what time. They know which concubines are favored, and which are being slowly edged toward retirement, their beauty eclipsed by youth. They know which ministers whisper about rebellion, but they speak none of it aloud. The information lives in their posture, in the precision of how they bow. One particular eunuch, known in the records as Ghaznafer Aga, rose to immense power during the reign of Sultan Murad III. He controlled palace appointments, investments, and even dictated matters of succession through subtle suggestion. But even he, at the height of influence, remained a man without a past. No one knew where he was born or what his voice sounded like before puberty. He commissioned fountains, but never drank from them in public. He funded schools, but never taught. His life was a series of perfectly performed gestures. But one night, during a festival, someone saw him pause beside a shadowed column, lean slightly forward, and whisper something to a dancing girl in a dialect no one recognized. The girl disappeared a month later. Whether it was punishment or protection, no one knows. This is how the harem functioned, not through violence, but through the fear of echo. A word spoken in the wrong tone might destroy a person, or worse, mark them forever as disloyal. And yet, inside this terrifying silence, strange forms of intimacy formed. Some eunuchs developed quiet friendships with the concubines. Not romantic, not overt, but something softer. The sharing of a song's hum, or the placing of tea just slightly warmer than usual. A hand briefly placed on a shoulder during grief. These gestures were not forbidden, but they were dangerous. Affection implied humanity, and humanity was a liability in a system built on control. Still, they happened. One eunuch named Aden reportedly carved tiny birds from olive pits and left them on the window ledges of the women who were ill. He never admitted it, never looked when someone picked one up, but the practice became known. And for a brief season, the women began to leave dried rose petals in return, pressed into the marble creases near the servants' halls. No one spoke of it, but something unspoken passed between them, and then it stopped. One day, without warning, a new supervisor arrived, a man who believed in a stricter order. The olive birds stopped, the petals vanished, and the silence returned, now heavier than before, as if memory itself had been replaced with protocol. Still, the rituals of daily life continued. The eunuchs woke at dawn, prepared baths, burned perfumes, and laid out fabrics. They watched the Sultan from behind screens, recording every smile or sigh. Some learned to interpret dreams, offering symbolic readings to calm anxious concubines. Others tended gardens, growing mint and basil for herbal teas. One even developed a secret recipe for sleep tonic, cinnamon, poppy, and honey, which made its way to the Sultan's bedside. They were everywhere and yet nowhere. Their fingerprints were on every object, every decision, every routine, and yet they were never mentioned. A eunuch could serve for 50 years and never have his portrait painted, never be granted, tomb with a name, and yet they were irreplaceable. The harem would not function without them. And in some strange way, this made them powerful. Not in the way a general is powerful, but in the way wind shapes stone, quietly, consistently, without recognition. But what happened when one of them fell in love? Was that even allowed? Could a body trained in obedience still remember how to want? The palace was filled with gestures so small they nearly didn't exist. The flick of a curtain, the placement of a fruit bowl half an inch to the left, the way someone inhaled before kneeling. But beneath these gestures were rivers of meaning, and sometimes, in the quietest corners of this marble world, even love tried to bloom. Not loud love, not the kind of love that announces itself with flowers or declarations. This was quieter, stranger, the kind of love that doesn't even know if it is allowed to exist. It began, as many such things did, with a look. The eunuch's name is not recorded, not truly. Some think he was called Farak, others say David, but even those names are only guesses, soft rumors carried like ash in the mouths of tired scribes. What we do know is this: he served tea. That was his task every evening, to walk barefoot through the cooling halls, past the golden tiles, and deliver rosebud tea to the concubines who had not been summoned that night. There were dozens of them, reclining on cushions, whispering about dreams or politics or memories of homes they barely remembered. Most never looked up. He liked it that way. It made him invisible. But one night, one woman, maybe 17, maybe 20, looked up. Not just at him, but into him. Not a smile, not flirtation, just attention. Real, dangerous attention. The kind he hadn't received since childhood. Her name, possibly, was Lolly, like the tulip. A name too soft for a world so cruel. She didn't speak, but her eyes stayed on him for a second longer than they should have, and he felt it. He felt seen. And that was where everything started to unravel. The next night, he brought the tea the same way, same posture, same silence. But this time, there was a note folded beneath the saucer. Not from him. From her. Just a line. A poem in Persian, barely legible. Something about the moon and forgetting. He pretended not to see it. Walked away. His hands were shaking by the time he reached the servants' corridor. He burned the note, crushed the ash with his heel, and said nothing. But the next night, there was another. And the next, always poetry, always soft. He never wrote back. But his silence was not rejection. It was preservation. A desperate attempt to protect them both from the system that punished desire, not with whips, but with disappearance. And yet, something changed. He began to smile, once in the mirror. He began to hum, barely, while preparing the tray. He found himself lingering by the doorway, an extra heartbeat. These were dangerous indulgences. And the palace noticed. Everything. There were no accusations. No trials. That would be too crude. Instead, one morning, he was reassigned. Sent to the outer kitchens. No explanation. No goodbye. No more poetry. The woman, too, vanished. Not entirely, but from the evening routines. She was no longer in the common rooms, no longer in the gardens. Some say she fell ill. Others say she was given to a provincial governor. Some think she was simply locked away until she forgot what longing felt like. And the eunuch? He never served tea again. He lived. He continued his duties. He survived, which in the harem was its own form of resistance. But something inside him folded shut, like a book too dangerous to finish. And yet, these things happen more often than records. Admit, the palace, for all its order, was full of people. And people, even broken ones, still carried sparks. Some eunuchs sang lullabies to newborn princes, their voices trembling with memories of their childhoods. Others carved secret names into the backs of ivory combs. One is said to have buried a lock of hair in a planter beneath the queen mother's balcony. No one knows whose. There are legends, soft and unconfirmed, of a eunuch who tried to escape, dressed as a merchant, head covered, walking with confidence. He made it as far as Galata before he was caught, brought back silently, not executed, just removed, like a chess piece taken off the board, not out of hate, but strategy. Others were more quietly destroyed. A mistake in protocol, a message delivered late, a cough in the Sultan's presence. Any of these could result in reassignment, exile, or vanishing. And yet, they endured. Their presence was essential, and they knew it. Strangely, this gave them power. They became keepers of secrets, the kind of secrets that didn't live in books. They knew which concubine cried at night, which prince feared thunder, which pillows to arrange after a royal death. They witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties, all while blending into the background. One eunuch, named Suleiman the Quiet, served under 3 sultans and outlived them all. He spoke so rarely that people thought him mute, but his ledgers were flawless, his memory perfect. He knew who paid bribes, who faked pregnancies, who poisoned whose sherbet. And yet he never used that knowledge, not for revenge, not for gain, just for order. But some whispered that in his final years, he wrote a secret diary, a book of everything, and hid it beneath the tiles in the Blue Mosque. No one ever found it, or perhaps they did and burned it, because the empire, for all its glory, feared the idea of eunuchs having a voice. A true voice, not the kind used for reciting orders, but one that could remember pain, that could describe what it felt like to be turned into a tool, to serve a machine that never said thank you. They never admitted they were human. But what if, in the deepest part of the palace, one eunuch found a way to leave behind something more permanent than a whisper? A hidden carving? A child left behind somehow? A ritual so subtle it became legend? Beneath the endless corridors of Topkapi Palace, below the courtyards where peacocks strutted and poets whispered into silken curtains, there were lower rooms, quiet places that smelled of parchment, wax, and warm stone. Few ever descended, there except the palace's most discreet, the scribes, the archivists, the eunuchs trusted with memory. This was where a man named Halim worked. He was not famous. He didn't rise to the position of chief eunuch. He never appeared in official portraits or held ornate keys. But he held something far more dangerous, time. Halim had survived 5 decades in the harem without vanishing, without error, without speaking more than was needed. His voice was calm, slow, and used only for function. He copied documents, cleaned old scrolls, and maintained the private ledger of gifts sent from the queen mother to the concubines. He knew, without question, which girl had been brought from which province, which one was a gift from a foreign ambassador, and which had faked illness to avoid the sultan's bed. But Halim had another task, one only he knew he was performing. For nearly 30 years, every time he sharpened a reed pen and dipped it into ink, he also wrote something else, a second record, not in Turkish, not in Arabic, but in a strange hybrid code, part Armenian, part Georgian, part nonsense, invented to fool even the sharpest royal inspector. It was a diary, a history, a quiet rebellion. In it, he described the things no one else bothered to write down. The boy who flinched every time the wind blew through an open door. Open door. The concubine who carved constellations into her soap. The sound of mourning when a eunuch died, and no one dared weep aloud. Halim called it the record of the unnamed, and he hid each page behind the backboard of the ceremonial book of Islamic law, knowing no one would open it without gloves and reverence. Over time, he filled 2 entire scrolls, parchment stitched with silk thread, smooth as breath. He included drawings, too, delicate linework of slippers arranged in mourning, the soft geometry of the hammam arches, the pattern of cracked tiles beneath the Queen Mother's mirror. And while he worked, he observed rituals. He lit a candle before each entry. He always began with the phrase, "Today, no one noticed," and then he would write. Some entries were short. "Today, no one noticed the girl who broke her necklace on purpose just to speak to someone." Others were longer. Today, no one notices that the Sultan's second son sleeps with a toy soldier sewn from the sash of a dead servant. Halim never shared the diary. He never hinted it existed. But its presence gave him something no title ever could: continuity. Proof that he, and those like him, were not invisible. One evening, late in life, he performed a ritual unlike any other. He chose a new eunuch, a boy barely 20, with large eyes and a scar shaped like a comma under his chin, and brought him into the archive after midnight. They lit no candle. They spoke no words. Halim simply took the boy's hand, pressed it to the cold marble table, and then placed a single feather beside it. A signal, a passing of breath. The boy nodded barely. Years later, this boy, now a man called Semel, became the last person to hold the scrolls. When Halim died, his body was bathed, wrapped, and buried quietly in the cemetery reserved for servants of the harem. No name, just a number, just as he expected. But Semel, now guarding the archive, decided to make one deviation. He carved a tulip into the wood beneath Halim's resting scrolls. No one ever questioned it. They assumed it was decorative. And in a way, it was. But it also meant remember. And so, the memory of Halim, of the unnamed, the erased, remained alive. Stories like his weren't rare, but they weren't spoken of either. The Ottoman system was not built on blood alone, but on forgetting. Erasure was smoother than execution. The palace knew that silence leaves fewer marks. But some eunuchs found ways to mark time anyway. One group is said to have developed a ritual involving light. They would reflect sunlight off polished bowls. At dawn, bouncing it between mirrors in the eunuch quarters to mark the passage of seasons. Another developed a chant, hummed only during washing linens, that included the names of those who had died in service. And another, more haunting tale tells of a eunuch who would walk the halls at night and lightly touch the walls with scented oil, 1 dab per soul, he remembered. Over time, the walls absorbed the scent, and no one noticed, but the memory was there. In every corner, in every silent breeze, something persisted. Something refused to disappear. Even the concubines, many of whom relied on the eunuchs as their only protectors, created rituals of gratitude. They'd slip small tokens, shells, petals, poems, into the folds of laundry. Sometimes they'd ask the eunuchs to braid their hair and hum songs from lands long lost. These were the only moments where human touch was permitted, however fleeting. The palace pretended not to notice, but everyone knew. And in these tiny exchanges, a song, a braid, a carved name, the concubines and the eunuchs formed something close to family. Not safe, not free, but real. What no one knew, however, was that one eunuch managed to leave behind more than memory, a bloodline, an impossible story, a quiet, impossible child, born of a secret never fully understood and hidden in plain sight. The palace whispered more than it spoke, and some whispers outlived the walls that once held them. There was one such whisper, never written in records, never confirmed by decree, that told of a eunuch who fathered a child. The very idea was a contradiction, an impossibility, a myth that could not survive the cold architecture of logic or the sharp blades of ritual. And yet the story persisted, not in books, but in lullabies, in servant gossip, in a half-forgotten melody hummed by an old washerwoman during the final hours of her shift. The eunuch's name has been lost to time. Some say he had been incompletely altered, that the physicians who operated on him had hesitated or misjudged, leaving behind a quiet thread of possibility. Others insist it was not physical survival that made conception possible, but magic, a concubine's blessing, an herb from the east, or a star that passed too close to the earth on a winter night. Whatever the origin, the story begins with A boy, small, pale, and quiet, born in a shadowed chamber behind the perfumed courtyards of the women's quarters. The child's mother, herself a concubine of uncertain status, claimed he was the son of a visiting diplomat. But no one ever saw that diplomat, and the timelines didn't match. The eunuchs who cared for the child, and care for him they did, strangely, almost reverently, knew more than they said. They didn't look at him with curiosity, but with familiarity, like remembering a song you used to hum without knowing why. The boy was raised in quiet luxury, never named in court ceremonies, but never hidden either. He was taught to read, and write far earlier than other children. He was allowed to roam parts of the palace normally restricted. He was seen speaking to elders with startling confidence, asking questions not about games or animals, but about calendars, tides, and the burial customs of vanished sultans. One day, a visitor from Cairo, an astrologer with thin fingers and eyes like black ink, claimed the boy had the shadow of two histories in him. Not royal, not servant, but something in between. Something the palace could not quite name, and therefore could not control. The boy's mother died when he was still young. An infection, they said. She was buried without fanfare. But the eunuchs, especially one older man with silver brows and trembling hands, began to visit the boy more often after that. They brought him books. They taught him older dialects. They let him ask forbidden questions. One day, the boy asked why his tutors always wore gloves. The answer never came. Instead, the elder eunuch handed him a key, small, brass, almost invisible, and told him it was for the quiet drawer in the archive. That night, the boy found the drawer, and inside it, a scroll written in a strange script, winding, half symbol, half verse. It was the diary of someone unnamed, a man erased by time. The boy read it by oil lamp, under a blanket, and wept without understanding why. Something in the script, in the way it curved, in the way it paused mid-sentence, felt like home. Years passed, the boy grew. He did not become a sultan, nor a vizier, nor a servant. Instead, he disappeared from official records sometime around his 17th year. But whispers say he walked out of the palace one evening wearing the robes of a eunuch, head bowed, and was never seen again. Others say he stayed hidden in plain sight, living in the outer gardens, tending herbs, and writing. In any case, traces of him began to appear. A poem etched into the base of a fig tree, a map painted on silk, showing the palace from the eyes of someone who moved behind walls. A lullaby preserved in a village far from Istanbul, with references to the man who birthed silence. It is said he wrote a book, not in protest, but in love, for the father he never truly met. A book of rituals, of names, of pain, translated into patterns. And in that book, he claimed the eunuchs were not sterile, but fertile in another way. Fertile with memory, with meaning, with invisible continuity. The palace, of course, dismissed it as fiction. No official source acknowledged it. But the story persisted, and the presence of the boy, whether ghost, myth, or truth, became part of the palace's bones. Some modern researchers, studying the Topkapi archives, discovered annotations in odd places, small corrections in ledgers, questions written in the margins, all in the same hand. They traced it back, potentially, to the boy. But no conclusion was drawn. What matters is not whether the child existed, but that the story did. Because even in systems designed to erase, something always slips through. A gesture, a glance, a page that resists burning. And if such a child did exist, if such a lineage began, what did it carry? Not just blood, but silence sharpened into vision. A legacy not of rebellion, but of survival. Of rewriting history in soft ink, under the noses of kings. But what about the rest? The eunuchs who left no child, no scroll, no tulip carved beneath a drawer. Were they truly forgotten? Or did they leave marks in other places, in recipes, in rituals, in the very architecture of obedience? There were places in the palace where no one spoke at all, not out of fear, but tradition. Spaces where the sound of footsteps was considered too loud, where the mere scraping of porcelain on marble could feel like a shout. In these places, the eunuchs lived. Their world was not governed by the rules of the court or the rhythms of politics, but by older, quieter codes. They spoke in glances, in pauses, in gestures so small they became invisible to those who didn't know how to see. But within that silence, entire systems thrived. Languages made from motion, rituals carved from routine, symbols hidden in plain view. One of the strangest things about the eunuchs of the Ottoman court was how much they communicated without words. Over the centuries, they had developed a semi-formal movement language, something halfway between sign language and choreography. A flick of the finger against a sash could mean danger. The folding of a napkin into a particular triangle might signal sorrow. 3 short steps followed by 1 long pause indicated a death in the inner quarters. No one taught this language. Officially, it was absorbed like breath, passed from elder to novice without explanation. And it existed for one reason: survival. In a world where speaking could cost you status, or worse, attention, movement became memory. The language evolved too. During particularly repressive reigns, it grew more complex. One report from a 19th century European diplomat mentions watching eunuchs pass messages in a garden without ever opening their mouths. He thought it was a kind of performance. He didn't understand he was watching a language more nuanced than anything he'd ever known. But it wasn't just communication that flourished in the shadow of silence. It was ritual. Every morning before dawn, a group of elder eunuchs would gather in a small room near the baths. They would light a single candle, not for prayer, but to mark the continuation of a vow, to remember the ones who came before. Around the candle, they would place 5 objects: a comb, a bowl, a length of thread, a slice of lemon, and a broken piece of tile. Each represented something. The comb was for the concubines, whose hair they had braided in secret grief. The bowl was for hunger, both literal and emotional, which they had mastered. The thread stood for all the names they had sewn into, garments and never spoken aloud. The lemon for the bitterness of memory. And the tile, always chipped, always from a discarded mosaic, was for themselves, fractured, removed, but once part of something beautiful. They said nothing during this ritual. The candle would burn for exactly 13 minutes, during which no one moved. When it extinguished, they left. No instruction, no explanation. This was not religion. It was remembrance. Elsewhere, eunuchs maintained their culinary traditions. Despite being excluded from feasts and public dining, they cooked. Together, often at night, creating dishes that bore no name outside their world. One dish involved steeping dried rose petals in goat's milk and adding honeyed grains to form a soft, perfumed paste. It was not meant to be shared. It was meant to be eaten in silence. Another, made only when someone died, combined ash from the incense with ground almonds, then pressed them into small discs and buried them near fig trees. The practice had no known origin, but it was observed across generations. And like so many things in their world, it was never discussed aloud. The eunuchs also created gestures of protection. A knot tied backward in a silk sash, a bracelet woven from loose threads plucked secretly from royal garments. These items were worn beneath robes, close to the skin. They believed it softened. Grief dulled memory, made forgetting easier. And in the evenings, when all their tasks were done, some would gather, never more than 4 at a time, and simply sit, not to speak, but to be near someone who remembered the same air, the same silence. These gatherings became known as the circle of breath, not a group, not a rebellion, just presence. One eunuch named Murad, who lived into his 80s, was known to keep a small jar filled with salt and tiny beads of wax. Every time he saw someone punished for speaking, he'd drop another bead inside. When he died, the jar held 317, but no one knew how many beads were missing. Over time, outsiders noticed some of these customs but misunderstood them entirely. European visitors wrote of strange obsessions among the eunuchs, describing them as overly meticulous or superstitious. But they failed to see that these were not quirks. They were strategies for endurance. In a system that devoured identity, these rituals offered shape, texture, meaning. They filled the cracks where the voice had been taken. And sometimes, these habits even influenced the palace itself. Certain sultans began adopting these gestures unknowingly, pausing before entering a room, breathing before speaking, folding a robe a particular way. All things learned from eunuchs whose presence shaped more than they were ever credited for. And yet, these practices began to fade with time. When the Ottoman Empire entered its final century, modernization swept away many of the older hierarchies. The power of the eunuchs diminished. The harem itself dissolved. And with it, the coded. Rituals that had once been a world unto themselves began to vanish, but echoes remained. In 1923, during renovation work in the palace, a hidden alcove was discovered behind a collapsed wall. Inside were a set of bowls, a candle stand, and a small piece of tile with a tulip carved into it. No one understood the meaning. The items were placed in storage, forgotten again. But someone, perhaps a historian, perhaps a descendant, one day noticed and began to wonder, what else had they missed? What other customs, songs, and movements had passed quietly through time, disguised as servitude but filled with memory? Long after the palace corridors emptied of footsteps, and even longer after the empire itself crumbled into dusty treaties and fading portraits, there remained certain stories that refused to die. These weren't recorded in scrolls or etched in marble, and they didn't appear in any museum display. Instead, they lived in the softest spaces, passed through breath, carried in rituals, whispered just before sleep among those who were never meant to speak. The eunuchs, whose histories were torn from them with knives and silence, invented their myths, private cosmologies made from loneliness and longing, stitched together from pieces of memory that didn't belong to anyone else. These were stories, not of gods or prophets, but of rooms that moved when no one was looking, of mirrors that never reflected the same face twice, of shadows that lingered just a little too long after their source had gone. The most famous of these myths among the eunuchs was the legend of the Whispering Wardrobe, a large cedar cabinet said to exist in a forgotten chamber near the Queen Mother's baths. According to the tale, if a eunuch stood before it on the night of the crescent moon and whispered a secret he had never told anyone, the wardrobe would creak once, and the memory would no longer hurt, not disappear, not heal, just stop hurting. It was never seen in daylight, and those who claimed to have found it never described the same location twice. But they all agreed on one thing. It smelled faintly of lemon and smoke, and when you stepped away, your shadow looked older. Another popular belief was about the mirror moth, a small, silver-winged creature said to appear only in the harem's abandoned quarters. If a eunuch saw it resting on a mirror, it meant someone he had loved, or forgotten to love, was trying to speak to him from the other side of memory. The moth wouldn't move. It would simply wait, and the eunuch would sit beside it in silence, sometimes for hours, until it finally flew away. The next morning, they would often find an object misplaced, a comb in a drawer never used, a slipper turned sideways, a petal pressed beneath the threshold. The message was never clear, but the feeling lingered, like dust in morning light. There were also tales of the room of the second name, a chamber said to contain a basin of still water, guarded by silence, where a eunuch could speak the name. He was given at birth, the name that had been taken, and here it echoed back in his voice. Not as he sounded now, but as he might have sounded, had things been different. No one could ever find the room twice. Some said it moved. Others said it didn't exist at all, that it was a test whispered by elder eunuchs to see which young. One still clung to the past. But those who claimed to have found it described the same things. Cold stone, no candles, and the feeling that time had paused, not to punish, but to remember. Beyond these mythical places, the eunuchs also believed in omens that were never written, but widely understood. If the bath steam curled in a certain way before dawn, it meant a death was coming. If a sparrow flew into the laundry corridor and did not leave by dusk, a secret would be revealed. If someone dreamt of broken bowls 3 nights in a row, it meant a concubine would attempt escape. These signs were not interpreted with panic, but with a soft, accepting rhythm, as though fate was just another servant moving silently through the palace. Perhaps the most sacred of all their quiet beliefs was the story of the unseen archive, a library not of books, but of breaths. According to this legend, every time a eunuch sighed in solitude, not out of fatigue, but of memory, the breath was collected by an invisible presence and stored in a chamber beneath the palace. In this invisible vault, each breath became a note in an eternal song, a melody that only the truly forgotten could hear. On rare nights, when the air was still and the torches burned low, some claimed they could hear it, a soft hum, rising from the stone itself, like a lullaby hummed in a language never taught. The existence of such myths wasn't just a way to explain sorrow, it was a way to reclaim meaning. For people denied ancestry, destiny, and desire, stories became sanctuary. Not grand tales of war or politics, but delicate fictions shaped like scars, small, precise, and impossible to ignore. These tales also bound the eunuchs together. Even if they did not speak aloud, they shared symbols. A carved crescent in the side of a desk, a thumbprint pressed into the wax of a letter, a specific knot tied in the folds of bedding. These were not just signs of presence, but signals of faith, not in gods, but in each other. They believed that when a eunuch died, his breath joined the archive, his memory flowed into the water pipes, and his scent lingered in the hallways for 13 days, after which, if unremembered, he became part of the stone. This was not a curse. It was peace. To become stone meant to become part of something permanent, to stop floating, to stop being erased. But not all spirits became stone. Some lingered longer. Some stories told of the red lantern, a light that flickered in the servant. Corridors when someone was about to break, emotionally, physically, or spiritually. If a eunuch saw it, he was meant to pause whatever he was doing, find someone, anyone, and sit beside them in silence for 13 breaths. The light would go out once this was done. If ignored, it would return the next night, brighter, angrier. It was not a punishment. It was a warning, a reminder that even those trained to vanish still carried weight, still needed witnessing, still mattered. And so, in the world of the eunuchs, filled with ceremonial silence, surgical obedience, and vanishing names, a second world pulsed beneath the marble, one of shadows, omens, and invisible sanctuary. But were these just stories? Or were they, in some way, more true than the empire that tried to silence them? By daylight, the eunuchs were visible, not in the way courtiers posed for portraits or warriors paraded through arches, but visible, like fixtures, like incense burners or ceremonial swords, always present, never acknowledged for their humanity. In the Ottoman Empire, Especially during the 16th and 17th centuries, eunuchs were not just chamber servants. They were embedded in the political machinery itself, functioning as the quiet mechanics of empire. The most powerful among them, the chief black eunuch, or Kisler-Akosk, wielded authority that rivaled viziers. He controlled access to the sultan's private quarters, to the harem, and often, by extension, to the sultan himself. To visit the ruler, even for a high official, meant passing through the gaze of this one eunuch, a man castrated in youth, stripped of origin, raised in silence, and now standing between kingdoms and crowns. It was a strange power, invisible yet absolute. And yet, it came at a cost no one spoke of, the emotional erosion of existing as a symbol more than a soul. The Kisler-Akosk could promote or destroy concubines, sway the education of princes, manipulate appointments, and manage imperial correspondence. But he could never walk freely through a market, or taste fruit from a stall, or sit by the sea without a task. His body had been rewritten for access, and access became its form of confinement. Below him, layers of hierarchy bloomed. Black eunuchs controlled the harem's logistics. White eunuchs managed palace education and security. But the structure was not merely functional. It was symbolic. The empire required a buffer between power and people, and eunuchs became that buffer, absorbing the weight of desires, decisions, and dangers that no one else wanted to claim. They were the witnesses of state secrets and bedroom rituals. They were the couriers of silk and betrayal, and they carried out these roles with such precision that their thoughts, if they had any left, were assumed to be erased. But no human functions like that forever, and some of them cracked. Some began to keep private notebooks in coded alphabets. Others built small shrines behind their sleeping quarters, dedicating them not to saints, but to unnamed ancestors, mothers they barely remembered, or brothers who never made it through the journey to Istanbul. One eunuch, named Idris, who served 3 sultans and managed the transition of power between them, was known to repeat a single phrase under his breath whenever he opened the golden doors to the throne room. I was not born for this. Not with anger, not with regret, just as a fact. It was said that Idris could identify a lie by the movement of a handkerchief or the pause in a sentence. He once exposed a rebellion plot by watching how a young prince stepped out of his sandals. But when asked how he knew, he only said, "The truth twitches." Idris never took credit for anything, and when he died, his funeral was attended by diplomats who never knew his name while he lived. His gravestone bore only the words, "He served." And this was the truth for many. To serve, to observe, to disappear again. But behind the veil of ceremony, another world pulsed, one of manipulation, of psychological power. The eunuchs, especially the high-ranking ones, learned how to influence without issuing orders. A gesture, a delay, a misplaced invitation, these were tools. And over time, this quiet influence bred fear. Some courtiers believed the eunuchs practiced sorcery. Others thought they used perfumes laced with mind-altering herbs to sway decisions. The truth was simpler and sadder. They listened. They remembered. And in a court where information was everything, memory was mightier than blood. But power did not erase isolation. A eunuch who rose too high often found himself alone, distrusted by the court, feared by the concubines, and resented by other eunuchs who saw his rise as betrayal. The higher they climbed, the more invisible they became. One famous chief eunuch, known only as Rezel Aga, was said to sleep in a chamber with mirrors on all 4 walls, not out of vanity, but to remind himself that he still existed. He reportedly spoke to his reflection before every major decision, not asking advice, but simply verifying his presence. "They see what I do," he once wrote in a private note, "but not what I carry." Others coped differently. Some began to plant gardens, hidden, walled-in courtyards filled with herbs and lemon trees, where they could touch something living without orders. These gardens were rarely acknowledged in official maps, but they existed, tucked between kitchens and archives, fragrant places of exile and refuge. Some eunuchs carved poetry into the stone benches. One line survives, "Let my shadow sit where I could not." But even with these small sanctuaries, the burden was immense, because unlike other servants, eunuchs could never claim fatigue, never plead hunger, never grow old in the eyes of the palace. They were meant to be permanent, tools without rust, minds without memories. And yet they aged, they ached. They sometimes cried, not with noise, but with stillness. A hesitation in the folding of linens, a longer blink before unlocking a gate. These were their breakdowns, and the palace, to its credit or cruelty, often noticed. When a eunuch showed signs of softness, he was not punished directly. He was reassigned, placed in quieter roles, sometimes even sent to oversee remote shrines away from the city. These reassignments were seen as mercy, but they were exiled by another name. Still, some found peace in them. One former Kisler Akas retired to a small house on the Prince's Islands, where he taught birds to mimic calligraphy rhythms by tapping on trays. He wrote nothing, but neighbors said his house always smelled of fig leaves and ink. And at night, music was sometimes heard, not loud, not joyful, just persistent. Like someone remembering how to be alive. It was said in hushed tones among the oldest servants of Topkai that the deepest sorrow was not to be forgotten, but to be remembered too clearly and never acknowledged. For the eunuchs who served not just as guardians of doors, but of secrets, this sorrow was a companion that sat beside them at every threshold. You could see it in the way they bowed just slightly longer after a sultan had frowned, or in how their hands lingered on the velvet of a robe after delivering difficult news. In a palace built on precision, even silence had its nuances. But what happens when silence can no longer hold its weight? When the body that has borne decades of obedience begins to tremble under the weight of things it was never allowed to speak. In rarely documented cases, eunuchs broke. Not violently, not with rebellion, but with quiet, disorienting collapse. One such eunuch, known in internal records only as Sem Aga, served through the reigns of 2 sultans and was widely praised for his memory. He could recite entire inventories from a single glance, remembered the scent preferences of over 40 concubines, and once spotted a forger by recognizing a thread count discrepancy in embroidered napkins. But after a quiet evening procession, he was found standing in the courtyard at dawn, barefoot, robe twisted, holding a pillow to his chest as though it were an infant. He did not speak. He did not blink. When approached, he asked softly, "Where did I put the laughter?" and wept for 6 hours without stopping. The incident was never investigated. He was reassigned quietly to a distant monastery near Bursa, where he tended lemon trees and never spoke again. Stories like his were rare, but not unique. The palace understood the value of ritual, but it also feared the consequences of emotion. Eunuchs who formed attachments to concubines, princes, or even fellow eunuchs were seen as unstable, vulnerable to manipulation. Yet, forbidden as it was, the connection still bloomed. Sometimes it began in small ways, the way 2 eunuchs exchanged tea trays during a change of shift, the way a concubine asked a particular eunuch to braid her hair a certain way each week. These were not declarations, not even confessions, just repetitions, gentle anchors in a life unmoored. One pair of eunuchs, Mehmet and Sadiq, became known within the servant circles as the twins, despite having no relation. They were never seen apart, managed opposite ends of the harem's hallway, and were known for humming the same tune during night watch. a low, slow melody with no words, but the rhythm of rocking. It was rumored that one of them had once saved the other from being wrongly accused of theft by silently taking the blame. Both were punished, reassigned to colder quarters, but never complained. When Sadiq died of illness, Mehmet did not attend the burial. Instead, he folded Sadiq's robe, placed a dried fig inside, and burned it slowly over a prayer lamp. He was seen kneeling beside the ashes until dawn. After that, he never hummed again. These gestures of grief were not acknowledged by the palace. Mourning was considered an indulgence of the free. Eunuchs were expected to process loss like they processed wine, with efficiency, order, and no trace. But the human heart is not a ledger, and betrayal, even soft institutional betrayal, leaves marks. One of the most painful forms of betrayal recorded was when a eunuch was ordered to turn against someone they had quietly loved. This love could be paternal, brotherly, or simply familiar, but the order was the same: deliver a message that would cause pain. Sometimes it meant informing a concubine she had been dismissed. Other times it meant escorting a prince to confinement. The eunuch could not refuse. He was the arm of the palace, and arms do not question the heart. One record describes a eunuch who delivered a dismissal scroll to a concubine with whom he had shared poems, verses slipped into bedding, never spoken aloud. When he handed her the scroll, she did not cry. She kissed his hand, whispered, "I forgive you," and vanished behind the screen. That night, he cut off his braid, a symbol of discipline, and buried it beneath the lemon tree garden. His duties continued, but he never again entered the women's quarters. These were not grand rebellions. They were quite ruptured, splits in the architecture of the self. And sometimes the collapse was not even visible. A eunuch might simply begin, forgetting, mixing up names, losing his rhythm in ceremonial duties. He would be quietly reassigned to archives or gardens. No shame, just ... edited out of visibility. Some left behind small symbols: a broken comb hidden beneath a cushion, a poem carved into the back of a closet, a strip of fabric tied around, a doorknob. These were not cries for help, but whispers of presence, proof that they had once existed not just as tools, but as feeling beings. And in rare cases, the connection survived even these collapses. A few concubines, long after their power faded, continued to write letters to former eunuchs. These letters were rarely delivered. Most were intercepted or destroyed, but some survived, folded tightly, hidden inside books, stitched into robes. One such letter was found centuries later inside a hollow writing pen. It contained only 6 words: "You were the only true witness." A witness, not a servant, not a mechanism, a soul. But the empire did not reward witnesses. It tolerated them, until they grew too heavy dot in a palace engineered to control everything: breath, movement, timing, even thought. True rebellion never came with banners. It arrived dressed as obedience. The eunuchs of the Ottoman Empire, silenced from childhood and shaped into functionaries of someone else's will, understood that to fight openly was to vanish swiftly. But there was a different kind of power, slower, softer, impossible to detect until it had already changed everything. It lived in pauses, in edits, in a name left off a list. The door locked 5 minutes earlier than expected. In the world of eunuchs, this quiet defiance became its language, a form of invisible sabotage so precise it passed as protocol. There was a eunuch known as Haki, who served during the final years of Sultan Ibrahim's reign. Haki was never promoted, never praised, and never noticed beyond his duties as a bathhouse steward. But inside the steam-filled rooms and marble chambers of the inner hammam, Haki listened, and more than that, he remembered. When a concubine cried softly into her towel, he made note of her name. When a janissary whispered plans of blackmail while undressing, he recorded the date. Haki never spoke of what he knew, but he kept a private ledger, written in lemon ink, invisible until warmed by a candle. Inside, he tracked every whisper, every threat, every injustice. But he didn't expose them, not all at once. Instead, he learned the art of delay. If a concubine was unjustly accused of theft, Haki might misplace the accusation scroll for a day, allowing time for the real thief to be caught. If a corrupt official planned to enter the harem under a pretense, the corridor he intended to use would, coincidentally, be under maintenance. These were not acts of rebellion in the traditional sense. They were acts of rebalancing. Haki saw himself not as a saboteur, but as a steward of invisible justice. And he was not alone. Many eunuchs, especially those nearing the end of their service years, took on apprentices, younger boys just inducted into silence, and taught them how to survive not through compliance alone, but through awareness. These mentorships were subtle. A glance, a correction in how to pour water, a soft reminder. Do not bow too deeply to the one who forgets your name. The lessons were not about anger. They were about endurance. One mentor, Baram Aga, taught his apprentice to tie his sash in such a way that it could signal danger if folded thrice. Another taught his pupil to listen for lies and laughter, to notice who laughed too hard and who didn't laugh at all. These teachings were passed quietly, without record, and often without acknowledgement. But they lasted. They became the whispered legacy of a people trained to vanish. Some eunuchs also found ways to influence policy. Those trusted with letters could slow down communications or rearrange the order of presentation, knowing that timing, in politics, is everything. A report delayed by a single hour could mean the difference between exile and appointment. And sometimes, these delays were intentional acts of mercy or strategy. One chief eunuch once intercepted an order of execution, a concubine accused of witchcraft, and instead presented a softened version to the Sultan, suggesting it was a matter of illness, not heresy. The concubine was sent to a convent instead. She lived. No one ever knew why, but the eunuchs knew. Their fingerprints were on every decision, even if invisible. The most powerful form of their resistance, however, was cultural memory. In a palace that erased origins, the eunuchs preserved fragments of identity. One archived lullaby in embroidery patterns. Another arranged the spices in the kitchen to reflect the map of his homeland. A third carved his native alphabet into the frame of a ceremonial mirror. These small acts, unreadable to outsiders, were declarations of selfhood, not loud, but enduring. And then there were the stories. Some eunuchs composed entire plays, performed in secret in the laundries after hours. These were not comedies or tragedies, but reenactments of palace routines, subtly exaggerated, softly satirical. The way a concubine summoned her eunuch with a bell was too fast. The way an official ignored a bowed head. The audience was always small, no more than 5 or 6, but the laughter, though muted, carried meaning. It was not joy. It was recognition. One eunuch, named Latif, even wrote a set of philosophical riddles designed to be unsolvable unless one understood the pain of being voiceless. Only 2 were ever recorded. One read, "I open every door but cannot leave. I witness every love but receive none. What am I?" The answer, of course, was a eunuch. But it was also silent. It was also survival. In rare cases, eunuchs leveraged their knowledge to shift dynasties. It is widely believed, though never confirmed, that one chief eunuch altered the line of succession by losing a critical document that named a volatile prince as heir. Another is rumored to have preserved the life of a bastard child, smuggling him to safety in the guise of a kitchen boy, who later returned to claim political power in a distant province. These legends blur fact and fiction, but their persistence reveals something important. Even within structures built on hierarchy, agency found a way to survive. And always, these acts of quiet sabotage came with a cost. Eunuchs who resisted, too cleverly, were often given honors, then reassigned. A soft form of exile. One was made manager of ceremonial towels, a role that sounded prestigious, but was located in a sub-basement no one visited. Still, he accepted, and every morning, he laid out those towels with the precision of a general, because to disappear with dignity was, in some ways, the final form of resistance. The palace never expected its eunuchs to age. They were trained as if time did not touch them, shaped into routine and silence, so rigid that emotion seemed a foreign country. And yet, time moved anyway, slowly, gently, like dust accumulating between tiles, like a scent that deepens over the years. The eunuchs grew old, and the empire never quite knew what to do with them. There was no celebration for years of service, no ceremony when the hands that once poured rose water began to tremble. They simply faded. Sometimes they were reassigned to smaller tasks, maintaining ceremonial linens, tending the archives of obsolete names, walking the halls at night to check that no one had forgotten to lock a gate. But their presence became softer, their steps slower, their role less visible even among the invisible. It began with small signs, a missed name in a registry, a folded sash is slightly uneven, a moment's hesitation before unlocking a door. These were not punishable offenses, but they were noticed. And once noticed, they were marked. Too quiet to disturb, too old to replace. That was the phrase whispered among younger eunuchs, half in reverence, half in fear. For to grow old in the palace as a eunuch was not merely to become weak, it was to become a living memory. And memory, in a palace obsessed with control, was dangerous. The older eunuchs developed their rituals for aging, not official, not blessed by the court, but deeply observed in secret. One such ritual was the folding of the fifth robe, a ceremonial act performed in solitude. When a eunuch felt his time of service had drawn near its close, either through weakness, illness, or emotional fatigue, he would select his fifth ceremonial robe, the one he had worn when first allowed to serve in the inner quarters. He would fold it with extraordinary care, smoothing every crease, aligning the sleeves with reverence, and then place it beneath his sleeping mat, beneath everything else, so that his body would lie above it for his final nights. No one discussed this openly, but when a robe was found folded in this way, others understood. The man had declared his departure. He would die soon. Some chose silence in those final weeks, not just in speech, but in presence. They walked more slowly, avoided eye contact, and took routes that would keep them unseen. Others, unexpectedly, became more talkative, not in rebellion, but in remembrance. They'd tell stories to the younger eunuchs in code, using metaphors of tea and garden paths, laughing softly at jokes no one else understood. They were not afraid, but they were aware. One elderly eunuch, known simply as Nuri, spent his final days in the archive hall, reorganizing old ledgers by sound instead of date. He claimed he could hear which documents had been wept over, which had been read in anger, which were sealed by trembling hands. He arranged them accordingly. No one stopped him. And when he passed, quietly, during an afternoon nap, his body was found still holding a pen, uncapped, the ink having dried in mid-air. Another, Halif Aga, once oversaw the Sultan's private garden, but in old age was moved to an empty corner room with no windows. There he tended a small bowl of soil he kept beside his pillow, watering it daily, though nothing ever grew. "It is not for growing," he told a younger eunuch once. "It is for remembering how to tend." When death came, it came quietly. No great funerals, no procession. The eunuchs were bathed by fellow servants, wrapped in white cloth, and buried in a cemetery just outside the palace walls, a space reserved for those who served but never belonged. Their graves bore no images, rarely names, sometimes only a title: the trusted, the silent, he who stood at the gate. And yet, among the eunuchs, there existed their method of mourning. It was called the empty gesture, a performance enacted the day after a burial. A fellow eunuch would perform a task the deceased once did, but intentionally do it incorrectly. Pour water into the wrong cup, fold a letter the wrong way, leave a door open too long. It was not to mock or forget, but to mark, to let the palace notice, if only for a moment, that something was missing, that someone had been there. The gesture was always corrected later, but never explained. Sometimes, after such deaths, the surviving eunuchs would gather in the early dawn, behind the kitchens or near the lower cisterns, and light a lamp in silence. No names were spoken, but each would place a drop of rosewater into a shared bowl. When the final drop was placed, they would wait exactly 13 breaths, and then pour the water down a hidden grate. This was their funeral. This was their legacy. Because for many of them, there was no family to mourn, no lineage to carry. The name, they were the end of their bloodline. And yet, their presence echoed in the palace's bones, in the routines still followed long after their death, in the habits unknowingly mimicked by those who had never met them. Even today, some traditions in Turkish state ceremonies, the way a cup is handed, the angle of a bow, the timing of a pause, can be traced back to rituals developed by eunuchs centuries ago. Their lives, though buried in anonymity, remain, folded into the empire's gestures. But what about the very last eunuch, the final one who outlived the empire, who walked through the ruins of what once was power and found only silence? They say the last eunuch of the Ottoman court did not die. He dissolved, not into myth, not into the marble bones of the palace, but into something gentler, harder to grasp, a memory left unfinished. His name, like many before him, is uncertain. Some call him Hussein Aga, others Farhad of the Garden Wing, and still others remember only his title, the final key. What is known, or half remembered, is that he lived into the 1920s, long after the sultans had abdicated, long after this caliphate dissolved, and the Turkish Republic was born from the marble ruins of empire. He was not young when the walls fell silent, already gray at the temples, already walking with the rhythm of someone who had counted too many steps for too many decades. But he remained, long after the guards were dismissed, after the concubines had vanished into marriages or exile, after the royal court had packed its rugs and tapestries and sailed toward forgetfulness. He remained, alone, not just in body, but in role. He was the last witness of a vanished order, the last man who had keys to doors no one would ever open again. And yet, each morning he rose. He folded his robe with the same precision. He poured water into the same basins. He walked the length of the women's corridor, pausing briefly at the harem gate, where no voice had echoed in years. No one ordered him to do these things. There was no schedule. But to stop would be to betray the habits that had sustained him. And so he continued. The palace was being turned into a museum. Men in Western suits walked the gardens, cataloging fountains and statuary. Turkish reformers, French architects, American photographers. They called him the Old One and asked him to pose near columns. He did. He stood where he was told, his hands folded, his gaze distant, and never spoke. Unless spoken to. Sometimes they asked about the past. Did the Sultan have hundreds of concubines? Were the eunuchs cruel? Did you ever love anyone? He would smile softly, almost kindly, and say only, "We served." That was all. But inside him, the memories still bloomed, not as stories, but as movements. He remembered the way a certain concubine hummed before sleep, the way the old bath steward used to knock 3 times before entering, the way jasmine smelled at dusk when the queen mother passed through the garden and never looked down. He remembered the children too, the princes who had not survived, the ones who had vanished into exile. And he remembered his name, the one given to him before he entered the palace. He never spoke it aloud, but he kept it folded into a scrap of fabric, tucked beneath a loose floorboard beneath his bed. When asked where he was from, he would say, "Here," not out of pride, but because to speak of origin was to risk remembering pain. The doctors visited him sometimes, sent by the new republic to ensure the last servant was still breathing. They offered pensions, letters of retirement. He declined them all. "I have no profession to retire from," he said once. "I was never a person in your census." As the museum took shape, pieces of the past were boxed and labeled. Ceremonial bowls, ceremonial robes, ceremonial silence. Hussien, if that was his name, helped guide the curators to certain drawers, certain keys, certain doors that no one else had found. He moved through the palace like a librarian of ghosts. In his final years, he spoke to fewer and fewer people. But he began to keep a box, not a grand chest, not locked with gold or ivory, just a plain wooden box, slightly cracked at the hinges. Inside, he placed small things. A slip of ribbon from a concubine's braid, a tiny bell from the garden cats, a spoon carved with a single tulip, and a stone worn smooth by 50 years of worry in the palm of his hand. On the inside of the lid, he etched a single sentence. This was all real. And then, one day, he disappeared. Not in a dramatic way, not with notice. A janitor found his bed made, his robe folded, the bowl of water near his door freshly. Changed, but he was gone. Nobody, no letter. Just the box, placed carefully in the center of his table. No one knows where he went. Some say he walked out at dawn and simply kept walking. Others claim he slipped through a secret passageway and went to live in a monastery or a mountain village or beneath the palace itself. A few believe he still walks the gardens at night, in a body made of dust and memory, folding invisible robes and humming lullabies no one else knows. The museum staff later placed the wooden box in a glass case, object number 4721, belonging to the last servant. No one understands its meaning. Visitors pass by, read the label, and move on. But sometimes, if you press your forehead to the glass, you can feel something warm. Not heat, exactly, but presence. Like the room itself is remembering. Not out of sadness, but out of softness. The last eunuch left no grave, but he left gestures. He left a pause in the middle of a hallway. He left a rhythm in the folding of cloth. He left a whisper inside a drawer no one has opened in years. And so, in that way, he remains. You can still feel them if you know where to look. Not as ghosts, exactly, but as pauses, silent notches in the rhythm of ordinary life. In a cup held with both hands. In the way, a hallway narrows for no reason, and then widens again. In the way, someone lowers their voice when passing under an arch. These are not superstitions. These are residues. The Ottoman eunuchs, whose names were mostly never carved, whose bodies left no descendants, whose voices were deliberately filtered out of history, nonetheless left behind patterns so subtle they became part of the structure itself. You can see it in the courtyards of the old Topkapi Palace, where certain windows face walls instead of gardens, not a design flaw, but a decision made to protect the privacy of rooms that held women and watchers. It was the eunuchs who positioned these details, who folded silence into stone. Walk through the ceremonial gate at dawn, and notice how the light strikes the stone. It hits one column first, always the same one, the one beside what was once the black eunuch's quarters. This was not a coincidence. The eunuchs, masters of timing and movement, understood how shadows could govern ritual. And so, even now, the light performs a kind of reverence, a bow made from warmth. Step inside a Turkish bathhouse built in the 16th century, and you might find, deep in the heating chambers, a tiny square niche in the wall, not for soap, not for water. A place to place your thoughts, that's what some believe. A remnant of a ritual performed by eunuchs before they bathed royalty. A gesture of clearing the mind, of becoming empty before entering the space of service. Even the scent of rosewater, so common in Turkish ceremonial life, carries their memory. The eunuchs prepared it daily, measured it by weight and feel, perfected the art of steeping petals so that no bitterness remained. It was used not just for cleansing the body, but for calming the heart, both for concubines before meeting the sultan and for eunuchs before entering silence. It is said that one particular ratio, 7 petals to 1 cup, steeped for 4 breaths, was known as the breath blend, a formula developed by an elder eunuch who had once been a healer. That formula, unknowingly, still governs the rosewater in some mosques and tea rituals today. There are other traces. In the design of the palace's mirrored corridors, where no one can see themselves directly, a metaphor is shaped in architecture. In the habit of removing shoes at a certain threshold, even when no one is looking. In the stillness expected before serving coffee in certain old Istanbul cafes, the cup is lowered without eye contact. These are echoes of a world built by people who were not allowed to own anything, not space, not family, not even time, and yet shaped everything. Even Turkish proverbs carry hints of them. The silent servant hears the deepest truth. He who has no sons must remember himself. Fold the robe as if the moon is watching. These are phrases without a clear origin, yet they appear in regional sayings, lullabies, and servant instructions, all rooted in the life of those who observed more than they were seen. Some scholars believe that the tradition of pausing before entering a room, a half-second breath held in the doorway, stems from eunuch protocol. They would always pause, not for etiquette alone, but to listen. Not just for footsteps or commands, but for the emotional temperature of the space. It was said that a good eunuch could tell from behind a curtain if a quarrel had occurred, simply by the way silence sat. That pause, that sense of the air itself having mood, is now a subtle part of Turkish home life, even in apartments built centuries later. The architectural footprint runs deeper. In homes influenced by Ottoman design, there are sometimes windows, with latches that only open halfway, corridors that bend around no visible obstacle, and alcoves that serve no practical function. These are not mistakes. They are fossils of a time when movement, especially of women and servants, was choreographed like music. The eunuchs were conductors of that movement, planners of pathways that allowed grace without collision, that maintained dignity through space. Even the shape of some garden paths, which curve for no reason and then straighten near fountains, reflects their understanding of rhythm. The sultans received credit, the architects received signatures, but the eunuchs laid the patterns. One modern Turkish garden designer once claimed, "We design with memory we do not understand." And perhaps that is the legacy, not of facts, but of impressions. The emotional legacies linger too. The atmosphere of gentle formality in elder Turkish homes, the way slippers are offered, the way tea is poured with just enough sugar to match the mood of the guest, comes from the service style perfected by eunuchs who had to read desire without asking questions. They learned to soothe before a command was made, to read the arc of a sigh, to detect loneliness in the way someone folded their hands. And that emotional reading, passed down silently, still shapes hospitality today. But perhaps the most profound legacy is in how silence is treated, not as emptiness, but as presence. In Turkish culture, especially among older generations, silence is not awkward. It is respectful. A moment of stillness after a guest speaks is a gesture of weight. This tradition, too, traces back to the eunuchs, whose entire lives were trained around the timing of silence, how to let it land, how to let it mean more than speech. They lived in the in-between, and they made that space sacred. So when you see a prayer mat turned slightly off-center, or a cushion fluffed just once after someone leaves the room, or a tray placed with the handles facing out, know that these are not quirks. They are choreography, left behind by men who were never meant to be remembered, but who shaped memory itself. The Ottoman palace was a fortress of marble, but behind the stone and beneath the gold, there were always words, soft ones, hidden ones, folded into sleeves and slipped. Between pages, no one was meant to open. The eunuchs, trained for silence and shaped by service, were never intended to leave a record. They were meant to function without identity, presence without memory. And yet, they wrote, not openly, not in scrolls stamped with royal seals, but in fragments, single lines scratched onto the wooden underside of a bed frame, dates pressed into the margins of ledgers, initials carved faintly into the back of mirrors. The most haunting of these remnants were found in the palace archives, not in the grand libraries filled with divans and chroniclers' histories, but in the servant quarters, in forgotten chests, in locked drawers of ceremonial bureaus, in pages thought blank until someone tilted them into the right light. Lemon ink, rose ink, scratched graphite dulled with water. One such discovery was made in the 1930s by a French curator working through a collection of court inventories. Tucked into a folder of towel counts and soap requisitions, he found a single sheet, no heading, no signature, just a note in curling. Ottoman script. I folded her robe every morning for 11 years. She never asked my name. It was not dated. It was not attributed, but it carried weight. Another was found on the back of a royal seating chart, a small poem in verse, trembling and almost erased by time. You stepped through me like rain. I did not stain your shoes. These were not confessions. They were acknowledgments, proof that beneath the ceremonial movements, a soul had been present, that someone, unseen, had felt something. Some eunuchs were permitted limited literacy, enough to copy court decrees, translate correspondence, or track goods, and it was through these channels that many left traces. Traces. Not outright stories, but modifications. A ledger in the spice room, for example, lists rose, cinnamon, mint, sorrow. Sorrow, written without explanation, in the same column as dried herbs. No correction ever followed. Others made edits to ceremonial texts. A copy of the Protocol of the Harem Gate from 1642 includes, in a corner, if the moon is weeping, step back before knocking. A poetic insertion, a superstition, or perhaps a memory disguised as etiquette. There was one eunuch, possibly named Salim, though that name might have been a placeholder, who served as a scribe and translator for nearly 3 decades. He was fluent in Ottoman Turkish, Persian, and Greek. His job was to copy letters from foreign embassies, clean and preserve manuscripts, and write ceremonial responses for the Queen Mother. In the margins of his work, now preserved in a university archive in Budapest, scholars have found strange annotations. Tiny stars drawn beside certain phrases. A single feather inked at the bottom of a love poem. A list of names repeated 5 times, always the same 5, and always in reverse order, possibly a memory or a private ritual of protection. Most striking, though, was a note found hidden in a scroll of tax records, dated faintly to 1687. If anyone ever reads this, please know I was kind. It was not boastful. It did not ask forgiveness. It simply stated a truth no one else had documented. I was kind. Imagine the courage of writing that in a world that refused to believe you existed beyond your role. Other writings were more surreal. Symbols arranged in spirals, letters composed entirely in mirror script, notes that begin in one language and end in another. One such piece, now called the Olive Scroll, is believed to be a meditation or prayer written by an elderly eunuch named Hamdi, who had once served in the gardens. It contains phrases like, "Breathe like the fig tree remembers," and "fold," each grief as if it were laundry for the moon. Its meaning is uncertain, but the softness of its rhythm suggests something more than ritual. It suggests longing. Some eunuchs never dared write openly, but left symbols. One placed a dried flower, petal between every 100th page of a legal register. Another carved dots into the underside of a banister, 5 for every year he served. Still another embedded a message in the spacing of his calligraphy, one line slightly longer than the others, marking a name. When historians tried to catalog these findings, they struggled. There were no names, no consistent handwriting, no direct links. But what they found instead was a pattern, the pattern of presence. These were not outbursts. They were quiet survivals, quiet refusals to be erased. Even now, in Topkapi's museum, there are scrolls believed to contain these silent messages. Most are mislabeled. Some are dismissed as scribal errors or decorative mistakes. But occasionally, someone reads one and pauses. Not because it is informative, but because it feels human. And that's what the eunuchs left behind, more than anything. A sense of a human mind pressing against silence. There are no official records of what the eunuchs dreamed, no journals filled with confession, no sleep logs, no sacred texts left behind in their hands. But there is a rhythm that survives, a kind of emotional architecture that emerges when you sit long enough with the silence they left. The dreams, as remembered through fragments and stories, passed from one silent breath to another, were not grand or prophetic. They did not imagine escape or revenge. They imagined small, impossible comforts. A hallway with no doors but full of singing, a pillow that speaks your name, a bowl of water that fills itself. Some said that the eunuchs, especially those who served deep within the inner palace, built entire inner landscapes inside their minds, places they visited each night when the lamps were snuffed out and the marble cooled. These landscapes were said to be shaped like mirrors, not reflecting the world, but bending it. One elder eunuch, before he died, whispered to an apprentice that every night he returned to a garden that did not exist. In it, the trees grew, backward, roots in the sky, leaves in the soil, and the wind smelled like his mother's breath. He said that in this garden, he still had a voice. He would sit beside a fountain that never overflowed, and each drop of water held a memory that never spilled. Another eunuch, younger and still in training, once claimed that his dreams were filled with cloth, endless bolts of fabric stretching over the sky, stitched with stars. In those dreams, he floated, not flying, but gliding through folds of velvet and cotton, listening for the scene that would take him home. The dreams were never shared openly, but they shaped the real world. They bled into routine. It became common for some eunuchs to create pre-sleep rituals, tiny ceremonies. Before lying down on hard straw mats, some would fold a corner of their robe 3 times toward their heart. Others would place a stone beneath their bed, believing it would absorb nightmares. A few whispered phrases before closing their eyes, not prayers exactly, but incantations. of self-preservation. Let no one remember my name in anger. Let the silence tonight be kind. Let the body stay asleep, even if the memory wakes. These were not written down. They were passed quietly, through gestures and tone, from elder to novice. One known ritual involved braiding a single thread, red, white, and black, and placing it beneath the tongue for 13 breaths. This was said to confuse the soul into stillness, making it too weary to dream. Others would sleep facing a specific direction, always west, believing that the setting sun, if mirrored by the body, would carry grief away like an outgoing tide. Some wrapped themselves in scarves given by former concubines, not for warmth, but for weight, to feel held. And then there were the dream guardians, not gods, not saints, but symbols created within the eunuchs' private mythologies. One such guardian was the listener, a faceless figure who stood beside the bed in dreams and collected thoughts that were too dangerous to keep. The listener did not judge. He simply took what was offered: fear, shame, memory, and stored. It's somewhere unknown. If a eunuch awoke with no pain in his chest, it was said the listener had visited. Another guardian was the watcher in the mirror, a double of oneself, seen only at a glance, who watched over the sleeping form and ensured that no bad memory could return uninvited. The watcher was often imagined as imperfect, eyes too large, hands too soft, but always kind. There were also stories of the breath shepherd, a presence that counted the sleeper's inhalations and guarded them against interruption. This belief led to the practice of laying rose petals near the nostrils before sleep, so the breath shepherd would follow the scent and not lose the dreamer's trail. Some eunuchs slept sitting up, backs against the wall, arms folded, not because it was more comfortable, but because it made it harder to be caught vulnerable. They believed the body, when curled like a child, might summon old fears. But when upright, even in sleep, one could remain a little less open to the past. Even the placement of the hands mattered. Palms upward were said to welcome dreams. Palms down was for nights when forgetting was needed. And some, especially those in mourning, would sleep with one palm up and one down, inviting memory and pushing it away at once. It was a language, a choreography of grief. There were dream stories, too, not just dreams, but tales about what they meant. A recurring image in many of these whispered myths was the endless room, a chamber with no ceiling and no floor, only low light and an endless stretch of soft rugs. In this room, the eunuch could walk forever without being called, rest without being watched, and speak without being punished. The endless room had no doors, no visitors, no time. Just breathe. Another image that returned was the water clock, a pool filled with floating lamps, each representing a memory. As the lamps drifted, they dimmed and relit at intervals. If a eunuch could count 13 without interruption, he was promised a dreamless sleep. This belief led to a quiet ritual before bed, where eunuchs would trace 13 small circles on their chests with their fingertips, in rhythm with their breath. Some did it in silence. Others hummed a single-note melody, a tone believed to repel sorrow. These dreams and rituals were never official, never discussed in front of others. But they persisted for centuries, carried in the way a blanket was folded, in the exact positioning of slippers, in the scent of lavender rubbed behind the ears. Even now, some modern Turkish customs echo them. The habit of placing something soft beside the pillow, the lighting of a lamp before bedtime, even if no one is afraid of the dark. The breath was held for a moment before lying down. These are not coincidences. They are inheritances, carried not by blood, but by breath, by breath. As the years wore on and the rituals faded into instinct, the eunuchs of the Ottoman palace, those who had survived the silences, the cold obedience, the velvet-wrapped pain, came to want only one thing, not restoration, not acknowledgement, but remembrance, and not even a loud remembrance, not fame, not statues, just to be remembered softly, gently, not as victims, not as martyrs, but as people who bore the unbearable and left behind something quieter than history, gesture. In the final years of their service, when their hands trembled and their eyesight dimmed, eunuchs rarely asked for comfort. They rarely asked for company. What they asked for, in the few cases where they asked for anything at all, was ritual. A certain way to be folded when they were gone. A towel was draped over the foot of the bed. A comb was placed beside the door. A lamp lit but not extinguished, allowed to burn itself out on its terms. These were not religious requests. They were human ones. In a life where so much had been taken, not just body, but origin, voice, future, these small arrangements became final acts of autonomy. In some quarters of the palace, it became custom to honor a retiring eunuch with a ritual called the softening. There was no public event, no music, no announcement. Instead, the eunuch's fellow attendants would, slowly, throughout 30 nights, begin to soften his space. They would use fewer starches in their linens. They would place dried flowers beneath his robe. They would turn his bowl half an inch to the left, not wrong, but gentler. On the final night, they would hang a single tassel on his door, blue or green, never red, and leave it untouched until morning. When he awoke, he would remove it himself, carry it in his sleeve for the rest of the day, and that evening he would no longer be required to kneel or bow. It was a silent release, a soft acknowledgement that this person, whose name may never be spoken, had done enough. In rare cases, when a eunuch passed away after long service, his colleagues would perform what became known as the gesture of the 5th day. On the 5th evening after burial, they would gather just 2 or 3 and perform one of his most repeated gestures. If he had been known for folding towels a certain way, they would fold the towels in that way. If he hummed before pouring tea, they would hum the same tune. If he had always paused in a doorway, they would pause. No explanation, no name spoken, just the act itself, carried out with precision, offered like a breath into still air, and then they would go. These were not acts of grief. They were acts of witnessing. To remember, not the facts of a life, but the feel of it, the weight of their presence, the shape of their routines. One eunuch, known to some as Kamal, requested that no one speak after he died, not for a day, but for a single hour, not out of reverence, but to let silence breathe him back into the walls. Another, Mustafa the Ink-Handed, asked that a single spoon be buried with him, not of silver, but of olive wood. He had carved it himself years earlier while waiting for a decision that never came. That spoon, to him, was not a tool, but a symbol of all the moments spent holding something warm for someone else. A few asked for their beds to be burned, not as rejection, but as transformation, to let the ashes scatter across the gardens, to feed the flowers they once trimmed but never touched. In some stories, eunuchs were said to leave behind instructions, simple lines folded into their last robe. Dust the corner I used to kneel in. Place a bowl of water near the north wall. Don't ask why. Sit in my chair for 13 breaths, then leave. These were not commandments. They were invitations. And for those who followed them, even without understanding, something often shifted. A quietness settled into the room. A calm. As if the walls exhaled. In modern times, there are households in Istanbul that still hold fragments of these gestures, though their origin is forgotten. A teacup was placed upside down beside the sink overnight. A curtain tied in a knot on the eve of a journey. A slipper is left facing the door instead of away. These are habits passed from grandmother to daughter, from servant to child. No one questions them. But they came from somewhere. They came from men who had no homes, but made every home more human. Who had no names, but shaped the name of the palace itself. Who asked for nothing, and left behind patterns made of grace. There are whispers, too, that one final ritual remains, one never written, never spoken aloud. When a eunuch died, some said, the other servants would gather his belongings and place them in a small cloth bag, not for burial, not for memory, but to be given quietly to the youngest boy in service. The child would not be told where the items came from, but over time he might use the comb. He might find the spoon helpful. He might hum the tune without knowing why. And in this way, the memory passed not as a burden, but as rhythm. Not as history, but as a gesture. After the eunuchs died, they didn't disappear. Not really. Not in the way history likes things. To disappear, with finality, with a page turned and a label affixed to a museum wall. Instead, they lingered. Not as ghosts, not as spirits in the candle flame sense, but as atmospheres. As a kind of unfinished breath suspended just above. The thresholds they once passed through daily. It is said, not officially, but in the quieter voices of those who work inside old palaces and mosques, that some spaces still remember them. Not because of carvings or relics, but because of how silence behaves in those places. There is a long corridor in Topkapi where sound will not echo, no matter how loudly one speaks. Visitors pass through, unaware, their voices swallowed like water into dry earth. No explanation has ever fully satisfied the phenomenon. But one archivist once wrote in the margin of her report, perhaps they took the echo with them. In the converted harem quarters, now a gallery of robes and mirrors, and old ceremonial perfume bottles, there are exhibits behind glass that visitors often walk past without noticing. The mirrors, in particular, seem plain. No adornments, no historical markers. But the caretakers sometimes report finding them smudged in the same place, day after day, despite thorough cleaning. A palm-sized blur, as if someone leaned forward, forehead resting softly, searching for something not in their reflection, but behind it. They clean it. It returns. No alarm is raised. Some things are simply accepted. In private residences near the old palace districts, older women still report dreams of quiet men standing in doorways, not threatening, not speaking, just present. Sometimes these figures hand them a folded cloth. Sometimes they point toward a corner where nothing lies. And sometimes they simply bow and vanish before waking. One woman, in her 90s, claimed a man in her dream placed a spoon beneath her pillow. When she woke, there was nothing there, but her sleep had been peaceful for the first time in years. These are not hauntings. They are what some now call echo presences, not souls, but echoes of the gestures of life once repeated so often they imprinted themselves on time. They remain where repetition met emotion, where obedience collided with longing. In the quiet corners of the palace, it is said that if you sit still long enough, you'll begin to feel watched, not by judgment, not by pity, but by patience. The eunuchs who once passed through these spaces, step by exacting step, now remain as a full, kind of emotional architecture, the shape of absence that makes presence possible. Some who clean the floors late at night report feeling a pressure on the air, not heavy, not frightening, just alert, like the room is remembering with you. And some scholars now suggest that the particular melancholy associated with old Ottoman spaces, that feeling of reverent sorrow mixed with grace, may come, in part, from the echo of those who served silently, shaping time without inscription. One museum worker said she could never arrange the bedding exhibit correctly until she placed the robe off-center by 3 fingers. It looked wrong, she said, but it felt right. No one had trained her to do this. And yet the adjustment was exact. These subtle presences are not exclusive to Istanbul. In other former palace cities, Edirne, Bursa, even in distant diplomatic mansions once owned by Ottoman officials, similar patterns emerge. A door that won't stay closed, unless bowed to first. A cushion that always shifts left overnight. A basin that never dries. Rational explanations exist. Drafts, settling foundations. Loose hinges. But something deeper lingers for those who live near these anomalies. A sensation of witnessing something unfinished. Not a story waiting to be told, but a rhythm still breathing. A few spiritual thinkers believe that the eunuchs entered a kind of timeless service after death, not to the empire, but to space itself. That their decades of walking, bowing, listening, waiting, trained them to recognize where pain sits in a room. And now, beyond death, they tend to that space, like gardeners of sorrow, shaping grief into something livable. They say that if you leave a bowl of rosewater beside a window on the longest night of the year, and wake to find a single petal floating inside, someone remembered you. Even if you forgot to remember them. There are newer traditions too. In some modern Turkish schools, young students are taught to pause before entering a historic site, not just out of respect, but to listen for old footsteps, a soft moment, a pause that aligns with breath. A ritual born of habit, passed from unseen lives. And in certain mosques, when prayers finish and the silence settles, elders wait a breath longer than necessary before standing. For those who stood when no one watched, they say, then rise. These gestures are not universal, not documented, but they travel, like wind patterns, like inherited gestures with no author. And in this way, the eunuchs remain, not as names or statues, but as the subtle grammar of silence. They became part of how we move through certain doors, part of why some courtyards ask us to whisper, part of why we fold cloth a certain way before placing it down. They are not waiting to be found. They are already here, in the part of us that listens to rooms, in the breath we take before we speak. And now we return to the beginning, not to start again, but to close the circle with care. A soft loop, like the folding of fabric over. Something fragile, like the final breath of a candle that has burned long past what was expected. We began this journey in the marble corridors of a palace where names were taken, bodies altered, and lives folded into silence like spare linens. In unseen drawers, we followed footsteps that were never meant to echo. We listened for breaths that were never meant to be heard. And through these long, quiet hours, we have walked beside those whose existence was both intimate and erased. The eunuchs of the Ottoman court, the watchers, the keepers, the forgotten. We did not come here to rescue them because they are beyond rescue. And we did not come here to explain them because their lives were shaped by systems that defy single explanations. What we did, instead, was remember. And in that act, slow, listening, deliberate, we honored something that history so often refuses to hold, the value of lives lived in the quiet spaces. Men who had no lineage, no tombs with statues, no biographies written in golden ink, and yet who shaped every corner of a world that dazzled the empires of Europe. We traced their gestures, how they placed a bowl, how they tied a sash, how they paused at thresholds not to wait, but to listen. We followed them through their sleep rituals, their private myths, their whispered griefs. We wandered the corridors, where they hummed to themselves while folding laundry at midnight, the garden paths they swept with steps as steady as breath, the mirrors they avoided, the windows they cleaned without ever looking out. We stood beside their stories, not as visitors, but as guests in a room that still remembers them. And now, as we prepare to part, perhaps you carry a piece of them with you, not in grief, but in gentleness. Maybe you will notice the way your hand smooths a bedsheet before sleep, or how silence fills a room like warm light, or how a single breath can hold a lifetime. That is how they endure. Not as history, but as stillness. Not as fame, but as memory shaped by gesture. Their lives were not simple. They were not merely tragic. They were vast, layered, full of contradiction and invisible strength. They were made to serve, and yet they shaped power. They were made to disappear, and yet they became the rhythm of the palace. Even now, in museums and habits past, down through generations, in the instinct to lower one's voice when entering certain rooms, they remain. Not in the statues, but in the shadows the statues cast. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the greatest monument is not stone, but the impulse to treat a doorframe with reverence. The habit of folding cloth slowly. The moment you pause before. Speaking not out of fear, but respect. If you have reached this point with your eyes half closed, with your thoughts gentle and drifting, then you have already participated in the last ritual. Witnessing. That is what they asked for, in the only ways they could. Not to be spoken for, not to be reimagined, just to be noticed. To be folded into time without being lost. So as the night deepens and your breath steadies, and the long thread of this story lays itself down beside you like a robe taken off after years of service, we close not with finality, but with offering. A final gesture. One you can do without rising, without speaking, even without waking. The next time you hold something, a spoon, a cup, a corner of a blanket, hold it like someone might be watching. Someone who once held it 1,000 times in silence. Someone who made it matter. Someone who lived a life you were never meant to know, but now do. Let the silence carry them. Let your stillness remember them. And if your eyes are closed now, then rest easy. You are surrounded by the softest echoes of lives that did not ask to be remembered, but are. Let us return to a single day, not a remarkable one, not marked by politics or punishment or whispers of scandal, just one of the thousands of ordinary days that passed inside the walls of Topkapi. Let us follow one eunuch, nameless, as most were, but known by his sandals, known by his habit of straightening the corners of prayer mats without being asked. He rises before the call to prayer, not from habit alone, but from breath. He sleeps, lightly, the way someone sleeps who must always be ready to move, to serve, to disappear. His room is no larger than a storage closet, its floor just wide enough for his bedroll and a basin. He sits up slowly, bones careful not to creak. The palace is still asleep, but the walls already breathe. He washes with cold water and wraps, his robe with precision. He lights no lamp. He does not need to see. His fingers remember. His footsteps are silent, not because he was taught to be quiet, but because the silence protects him from becoming part of the noise. First, he walks to the corridor, just outside the concubines' wing. There, he places a tray on a small stand. Water, rose petal cloth, a folded note from the Queen Mother. He knocks once, the kind of knock that means, I have come and will go. He never sees the hand that collects the tray. He doesn't wait for it. He simply turns. He checks the towels, straightens the lanterns, replaces the wilted basil on a shelf in the bathhouse. No one notices him, but everything he touches remains touched, briefly improved, briefly tended. As the sun begins to warm the walls, he returns to the kitchens to collect the bowl he has requested, a small serving of plain rice, just enough. He eats alone, in the corner, standing. He never learned the habit of sitting while eating. After all, service is not paused for hunger. When he's finished, he walks to the linen chamber. The older eunuchs nod to him. They speak rarely, but when they do, it is in tones wrapped in air. One says, the child is coughing again. Another mutters, "Fold the queen mother's robe tighter today." She is cold with memory. He nods. No one asks how he knows what. He knows. He arranges the fabrics for the day. Deep purple for mourning, cream for ceremony, blue for private rooms. He checks each one for stains, not because he fears punishment, but because perfection is his only protection. By midday, the palace is alive. The Sultan has moved through 3 rooms. The concubines have begun their mirror rituals, and the advisors pace the marble floor, waiting to be noticed. And the eunuch, our eunuch, is now stationed by the inner gate. He does not look up. His gaze remains slightly lowered, respectful but aware. He sees everything. He remembers everything. A sandal strap is out of place. A gesture repeated. A scent too strong. These are his vocabulary. These are how he understands the mood of a day. He delivers a message to the bath steward. Use the smaller towels today. The queen mother seeks modesty. He offers a bowl to a left-handed child prince. Left-handed, because the boy has been favoring that side. No one tells him to do these things. They are the texture of intuition. And still, he says nothing. When a new eunuch arrives, nervous, shoulders high, our eunuch takes his hand gently and places it on the hinge of the harem gate. The metal is warm. Feel the weight, he whispers. This is what we hold. It is the only thing he says that day. At dusk, he lights a single lantern by the hallway to the prayer room. Not because it is dark, but because the queen mother prefers that flame before reflection. He leaves a folded note for a concubine who has lost a child, unsigned, written. In lemon ink, you were not the only one who loved him. He does not expect an answer. He knows there will be none. He returns to his room as the evening call to prayer slides through the air like silk. He unties his sash slowly, folds it 3 times, places it on the pillow. He kneels, not in prayer, not in ritual, but in stillness. A kind of remembering, a kind of returning. He does not cry, not because he cannot, but because crying has too much gravity. His life has become weightless in service. He closes his eyes. He dreams of a hallway without walls. He wakes before. The dream ends. Outside, the wind touches the edge of the window. The bowl of water beside his bed ripples slightly. He breathes once, slowly, then again, and waits for morning, for morning. Perhaps your eyes are heavy now. Or perhaps your mind is still quietly pacing the same marble corridors where we began, tracing the steps of men whose names we never fully knew. It's okay to linger there a moment longer, because these were not stories meant to end with answers. These were lives made from unfinished moments, from routines interrupted by memory, from voices shaped by silence. We have walked alongside the eunuchs of the Ottoman Empire, through heat and marble, through incense and mourning, through hallways lit only by habit. We followed them not to witness a spectacle, but to feel presence. Their lives were never loud. Their resistance was not rebellion. Their dignity was not declared. It was folded, one corner at a time, into the shape of a robe laid gently across a bed, into the softness of a teacup turned outward before serving, into the quiet weight of breath held before entering a room. These were men who held grief like a ceremony, who bore history like perfume on the wrist, unseen, but carried everywhere. Men who had no families, and yet fathered the rhythm of the palace, who braided hair for women they could never touch, who watched princes grow and die, watched queens weep behind veils, watched the empire swell and shrink like lungs beneath heavy cloth. They were not permitted to want, and yet they wanted, not for power, not for voice, but for stillness, for the kind of silence that is honored, not ignored, for the kind of remembrance that doesn't require a name. And so they left traces, not in the official records, But in the ritual pause of a servant's hand, in the crooked smile on a mirror's edge, in the invisible ink of a prayer no one wrote down, you might never see their faces. But you have seen what they shaped. You have walked through spaces they calibrated for grace. You have used habits that they refined into gestures. And now, having heard them even like this, through a voice built centuries later, perhaps they live again, not loudly, not fully, but gently, like a breath taken at the edge of sleep. So if you're lying in bed now, and your room is quiet, and your thoughts are dimming, maybe imagine one last scene. A small room, stone walls, a window half open. A man sits cross-legged on a woven mat. His robe is worn, but clean. His eyes are closed. There is nothing around him but a folded towel, a bowl of water, and a tiny lamp that flickers with no urgency. He is not waiting. He is not afraid. He is not remembered, not really. But he is not lost either, because someone new has witnessed him now. And that is enough. That is everything. So rest now. Let your breath become soft. Let your thoughts untie. Let the long story fold itself around you like a cool sheet. There is nothing left to hold, nothing left to fear, only silence. And the gentle, enduring memory of those who once served the world by disappearing inside it. Good night.